Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting on the subject of journalists and police and their involvement in the most recent Black Lives Matter protests that have been occurring across the country for about the last month and a half. They began around late May after the brutal murder of George Floyd after he was arrested by police. And on June 6th, about 500,000 people began to protest across the country in major cities and in smaller cities as well. And to follow, a bunch of journalists obviously went to go document those protests. And from the beginning of those protests, there were police that were targeting journalists that were covering the protests, and they were specifically going after the press, even when they were deliberately saying, we are, part of press, we are subject to allowed to document these protests and shoot, and were arrested. Many of them were arrested, even more so were assaulted. Some of their camera gear also destroyed, and so forth. And this kind of pattern of targeting journalists specifically has been going on since the civil rights era and has continued on through the Ferguson riots and then now into the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter protests. So I'm going to be specifically talking about an issue that's currently still happening in Seattle. And so there have been protests that have been particularly active in Seattle, and they've been going on since May. And there have been protests that have been occurring, night and day. Some have been peaceful, some have been violent. And as well, there have been journalists who have been documenting that experience. So basically, what happened was on June 18th of 2020, Seattle police requested a subpoena of 5 local media outlets, and they wanted to get specifically all video footage and photographs that were taken on May 30th from 3:30 to 5 p.m. within a 4-block radius. And that night specifically, there was a lot of destruction of police vehicles and window breaking and so forth, but they wanted to specifically take away all of the non-published raw footage, raw videos, so that they could use that in an investigation towards whoever was causing those crimes. So they requested the subpoena, and the news outlets joined together, and they essentially filed a joint brief and objected the subpoena. And they stated that it violated not only their First Amendment right, as well as the Washington Shield law that protected journalists from being able to collect information that could be used for stories and document what was happening in the area. So there's a couple issues with the police requesting to subpoena the information that was collected from the journalists. And some of that has to do with public perception of reporters and also their idea of what a journalist and what media outlets are doing to comply with law enforcement, which there's some a couple of different things where there's some infringement on free speech, obviously, and then also what the law enforcement can control versus what is just supposed to be available to the public. And they didn't want to mislead their public audience by essentially, saying that they were complying with the law enforcement only. So they wanted to keep public trust in their highest regard. It was also important for the media outlets to remain independent of the law enforcement because then they're staying ethical and not becoming one unified source. And there was obviously a lot of violence going on at these protests, some of them, and many reporters were putting themselves at risk, even just getting the footage. So they weren't really keen on handing it all over to the police, who were just going to be using it to arrest people that were at the protest. So essentially, as of now, there's no, they haven't been required to hand over the information or the footage and assets that were collected on May 30th, and they will not have to make a decision until 3 days from now, so on July 16th, when they will hand this over to the Superior Court, and there will be a hearing and a subsequent ruling on the case. And here are my sources for this presentation. Thanks.